The silence at the dinner table was deafening as my mother's words hung in the air like a poison cloud. "You know what, Jessica? You've always been the family mistake. Your brother Michael is a successful lawyer. Your sister Sarah runs her own marketing firm, and here you are, still figuring out your life at 32. The other family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats at Romano's, the upscale Italian restaurant where we were celebrating my nephew's graduation. My Aunt Patricia looked down at her plate, while my cousins exchanged awkward glances. My mother, Linda Morrison, sat back in her chair with that familiar look of disappointment etched across her face, as if my very existence was a personal affront to her carefully curated family image. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the failure sitting across from her owned the very apartment building where she'd been living for the past 8 years. The building she complained about constantly, the one with the mysterious new owner who'd been making improvements and keeping her rent remarkably low. That owner was me. But let me take you back to how we got to this moment, because the story of how I went from family disappointment to secret real estate mogul is one that changed everything about how I saw myself, my family, and the power of patience and strategic thinking. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as the youngest of 3 children in the Morrison household wasn't just challenging, it was a masterclass in feeling invisible while simultaneously being under constant scrutiny. From the earliest age I can remember, there was an unspoken hierarchy in our family that placed me firmly at the bottom, not through any official declaration, but through 1,000 small moments that accumulated into an undeniable truth. My older brother Michael had claimed the role of the golden child early on. Born with the kind of natural charisma that made adults light up when he entered a room, Michael excelled at everything he touched. Sports came naturally to him. He was captain of both the football and baseball teams throughout high school. Academics were equally effortless. He graduated valedictorian and received a full scholarship to Harvard Law School. Even his rebellious teenage years somehow managed to be charming rather than concerning. When he got caught sneaking out to parties, my parents would chuckle and say things like "boys will be boys," with obvious pride in his social popularity. My sister Sarah occupied the middle position with grace and strategic precision. She understood early on that she couldn't compete with Michael's natural advantages, so she carved out her own territory as the responsible, practical one. Sarah became the family organizer, the one who remembered birthdays, planned holiday gatherings, and somehow managed to make herself indispensable to everyone's emotional well-being. She had an intuitive understanding of social dynamics that served her well throughout school and into her professional life. While Michael commanded attention through natural magnetism, Sarah earned respect through competence and reliability. Then there was me, Jessica Morrison, the unplanned surprise who arrived 6 years after Sarah when my parents thought they were done having children. From the beginning, my existence seemed to represent not joy, but disruption to the carefully balanced family ecosystem my parents had established. Where Michael and Sarah had been met with excitement and preparation, I was met with exhaustion and resignation. The baby photos tell the story clearly. While Michael and Sarah's early albums are filled with professional portraits and carefully documented milestones, my early years are captured in hasty snapshots that seem more obligatory than celebratory. These family dynamics were established early and reinforced consistently throughout my childhood. Michael was the star whose achievements brought prestige to the family name. Sarah was the glue who held everyone together through her thoughtful attention to relationships and responsibilities. I was the extra one. The mistake. As my mother would eventually put it so bluntly during that dinner at Romano's. This wasn't necessarily expressed through outright cruelty or neglect, but rather through 1,000 subtle communications that conveyed my secondary status in the Family hierarchy. When Michael received acceptance letters from multiple prestigious universities, the whole family celebrated with a special dinner and calls to relatives. When Sarah landed her first major client for her marketing startup, my parents threw her a surprise party and proudly shared the news with their social circle. When I graduated college with a solid B+ average from State University, the acknowledgement was perfunctory. A brief congratulations before the conversation moved on to more interesting topics. The pattern extended to everyday interactions as well. Family conversations naturally centered around Michael's legal cases or Sarah's business challenges, with everyone eagerly offering opinions and advice. When I tried to share my own experiences or concerns, the attention would be polite but brief, before inevitably shifting back to my siblings' more compelling narratives. It wasn't that my parents actively disliked me, but rather that they seemed perpetually puzzled by my existence and uncertain about how to integrate me into their vision of family success. School became my first refuge from this dynamic, though not in the way you might expect. I wasn't a natural academic star like Michael, nor did I have Sarah's intuitive social intelligence. Instead, I found myself drawn to subjects and activities that none of my family members understood or valued. While they were focused on traditional markers of success, grades, awards, social popularity, I became fascinated by things that seemed practical and concrete rather than theoretical or prestigious. My interest in real estate began almost by accident during high school when I took an elective called personal finance that most students treated as an easy credit. The teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, had spent 15 years as a commercial real estate agent before transitioning to education, and he brought a practical, real-world perspective to concepts that other teachers presented in purely theoretical terms. When we studied compound interest, he didn't just show us formulas. He explained how real estate appreciation had allowed him to build wealth steadily over time through strategic property investments. Unlike my siblings, who seemed to have inherited my parents' preference for prestigious career paths that provided social status and recognition, I found myself captivated by the mathematical precision and strategic thinking required for successful real estate investment. There was something deeply satisfying about analyzing market trends, calculating cash flow projections, and identifying undervalued properties that had potential for improvement and appreciation. The summer after my junior year of high school, while Michael was interning at a prestigious law firm and Sarah was gaining experience at a high-end marketing agency, I convinced Mr. Rodriguez to let me volunteer with his weekend real estate activities. He had maintained his license and continued doing small deals on the side, primarily helping teachers and other school district employees find affordable housing options. Those Saturday mornings spent visiting properties, analyzing rental yields, and learning about neighborhood development patterns provided me with an education that felt more valuable and immediately applicable than anything I was learning in traditional classroom settings. Mr. Rodriguez taught me how to read market indicators, evaluate property conditions, and understand the complex relationships between location, demographics, and investment potential. More importantly, he introduced me to the concept of passive income and long-term wealth building through strategic asset accumulation. While my family measured success through annual salaries and professional titles, Mr. Rodriguez showed me how patient, strategic real estate investment could create financial independence that wasn't dependent on continuous active work or employer relationships. By my senior year of high school, I had developed a sophisticated understanding of local real estate markets and had even identified several properties that represented compelling investment opportunities. Of course, as an 18-year-old, with no credit history or capital, these insights were purely theoretical. But the analytical framework and strategic thinking skills I was developing would prove invaluable in the years to come. My family's reaction to my interest in real estate was predictably dismissive. When I tried to share what I was learning during family dinners, the response was polite but clearly uninterested. My parents seemed to view real estate as something that working-class people did when they couldn't qualify for more prestigious careers. The idea that real estate investment could be a sophisticated wealth-building strategy wasn't something that fit into their understanding of professional success and social status. This dismissal actually worked to my advantage in ways that wouldn't become apparent for several years. Because my family didn't take my real estate interests seriously, they didn't feel the need to monitor or influence my activities in this area. While they closely tracked Michael's academic performance and Sarah's extracurricular achievements, my weekend property visits and real estate research were treated as harmless hobbies that didn't warrant much attention or concern. College selection became another point of family tension that ultimately reinforced my outsider status. While Michael had been courted by Ivy League schools, and Sarah had carefully chosen a prestigious private university known for producing successful business leaders, my college choice was viewed as settling for less ambitious options. State University wasn't embarrassing exactly, but it certainly wasn't impressive either. What my family didn't understand was that I had chosen State University specifically because of its excellent real estate and urban planning programs, not despite any limitations they perceived. The school had partnerships with local development firms and offered practical internship opportunities that aligned perfectly with my long-term strategic objectives. While my siblings were focused on schools that would provide social networking advantages and prestigious credentials, I was focused on programs that would provide practical skills and industry connections. The 4 years I spent at State University were transformative in ways that my family never recognized or acknowledged. While they measured my college success through the traditional metrics of grades and social activities, both areas where I performed adequately but not exceptionally, I was building knowledge, skills, and relationships that would form the foundation of everything I would achieve in the coming years. The real estate program at State University provided rigorous training in property valuation, market analysis, construction management, and real estate law. But more importantly, it connected me with professors who were active investors and developers, classmates who shared my passion for strategic property investment, and industry professionals who could provide mentorship and guidance as I developed my investment strategies. By the time I graduated from college, I had accumulated knowledge and connections that positioned me perfectly for success in real estate investment. But I also understood that my family would never recognize or value these achievements unless they resulted in the kind of obvious financial success that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. The stage was set for what would become a decade-long process of building wealth and independence while maintaining the appearance of being the family disappointment who still hadn't figured out her life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The transition from college graduate to working professional marked the beginning of what I now recognize as the most crucial phase of my wealth-building journey. Though at the time, it felt more like stumbling through a series of carefully calculated risks while my family watched with barely concealed disappointment at my unconventional career choices. Fresh out of State University with my degree in real estate and urban planning, I faced the same challenge that confronts most new graduates: how to bridge the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application when you have no capital, limited credit history, and a family that views your chosen field as somehow beneath their expectations for professional success. My first job was with Henderson & Associates, a mid-sized commercial real estate firm that specialized in retail and office space leasing throughout the greater Chicago metropolitan area. The position was officially titled Junior Leasing Associate, which sounded impressive enough when I announced it at family gatherings, but the reality was considerably more humble. My daily responsibilities included cold calling potential tenants, preparing market analysis reports, and accompanying senior agents to property showings where I was expected to take notes and learn by observation. The salary was $42,000 annually, respectable for a recent graduate, but hardly the kind of immediate financial success that would impress my family or provide the capital I needed for real estate investments. What made the position valuable wasn't the immediate compensation, but rather the education I received in commercial real estate markets and the relationships I began building with investors, developers, and property managers throughout the Chicago area. Working at Henderson & Associates provided me with insider knowledge about market trends, property valuations, and investment opportunities that weren't available to general public investors. I learned to read market indicators that predicted neighborhood development patterns months or even years before they became obvious to casual observers. More importantly, I gained access to off-market deals and investment opportunities that required industry connections and professional relationships to discover. During my first year at Henderson & Associates, I identified a pattern that would become the foundation of my investment strategy. Many of the commercial properties we managed were owned by individual investors who had purchased buildings decades earlier when prices were significantly lower. These investors were often approaching retirement age and beginning to consider selling their properties, but they faced substantial capital gains tax consequences that made immediate sales financially unattractive. The solution many of these investors preferred was seller financing arrangements that allowed them to receive steady monthly payments while deferring tax obligations over extended periods. For buyers, these arrangements provided access to properties with minimal down payments and financing terms that were often more favorable than traditional bank loans. The challenge was that most potential buyers in this market were other experienced investors who could afford substantial down payments and had extensive real estate portfolios that qualified them for favorable financing terms. As a 22-year-old with minimal savings and no investment track record, I didn't fit the typical buyer profile that sellers expected for these opportunities. However, my position at Henderson & Associates provided me with detailed knowledge about these properties and direct relationships with their owners, creating opportunities that weren't available to outside investors. I began developing relationships with property owners who appreciated my thoroughness in managing their assets and my genuine interest in understanding their long-term financial objectives rather than simply pushing for immediate transactions. My key breakthrough came during my second year at Henderson & Associates when I encountered Margaret Chen, a 73-year-old widow who owned a small apartment building in Lincoln Park that she was considering selling. The building contained 6 units and had been in her family for 45 years. Originally purchased by her late husband for $48,000 in 1978. The property was now worth approximately $850,000. But Mrs. Chen was reluctant to sell because of the massive capital gains tax liability she would face. Through our conversations about her situation, I learned that Mrs. Chen's primary concern wasn't maximizing the sale price, but rather ensuring steady monthly income to supplement her retirement while avoiding the tax consequences of an immediate sale. She was also concerned about finding a buyer who would treat her long-term tenants fairly and maintain the building's character rather than converting it to expensive condominiums. I proposed a seller financing arrangement that addressed all of her concerns while providing me with the opportunity to acquire my first investment property. The structure I suggested involved a purchase price of $820,000 with a down payment of $82,000 and the remaining balance financed through a private mortgage from Mrs. Chen at 6% interest over 20 years. This arrangement provided her with monthly payments of approximately $4,400 while allowing me to acquire the property with a down payment that I could manage through careful savings and a small loan from my 401k. The numbers worked because the building's rental income was $5,200 monthly, providing positive cash flow of $800 after mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance, and maintenance reserves. More importantly, the property was located in a neighborhood that showed strong indicators for continued appreciation, suggesting that the building's value would increase substantially over the 20-year mortgage period. Convincing Mrs. Chen to accept this proposal required months of careful relationship building and detailed financial analysis that demonstrated how the arrangement served her interests better than traditional sale alternatives. I prepared comprehensive market analyses, tax calculations, and cash flow projections that showed the long-term benefits of seller financing compared to immediate sale options. The closing process took place in November 2014, exactly 18 months after I had started working at Henderson & Associates. At 23 years old, I became the owner of a 6-unit apartment building in one of Chicago's most desirable neighborhoods. The down payment of $82,000 represented essentially all of my savings, plus a $15,000 loan from my 401k, making this investment a significant financial risk that would determine whether my real estate strategy was viable or foolishly optimistic. My family's reaction to this purchase was predictably mixed. When I announced that I had bought an apartment building, there was initial surprise and cautious approval. Real estate ownership sounded like a legitimate adult accomplishment. However, when the details emerged about the seller financing arrangement, the significant debt I had taken on, and the fact that I was now a landlord responsible for tenant issues and property maintenance, their enthusiasm quickly shifted to concern about my financial judgment and life choices. My mother expressed particular worry about the risks involved in real estate investment and the responsibilities of property management. "Jessica, you're 23 years old, and you've taken on enormous debt for a building that could have all kinds of problems. What if the tenants don't pay rent? What if there are major repairs needed? You could lose everything you've worked for." These concerns weren't entirely unreasonable, and they reflected legitimate risks that I had considered carefully during my decision-making process. However, they also reflected my family's general preference for safe, traditional career paths over entrepreneurial ventures that involved calculated risks and potential for significant rewards. What my family didn't understand was that I had spent months analyzing every aspect of this investment, from the building's structural condition to the financial stability of existing tenants to the neighborhood development trends that suggested strong future appreciation potential. The risk management strategies I had developed included substantial cash reserves for unexpected expenses, comprehensive insurance coverage, and detailed tenant screening procedures that would minimize rental income disruptions. More importantly, this first property purchase represented the implementation of a long-term wealth-building strategy that would eventually provide financial independence and passive income that far exceeded anything I could achieve through traditional employment, regardless of how successful my career progression might be. The first year of property ownership provided intensive education in every aspect of real estate investment and property management. I learned to handle tenant communications, coordinate maintenance and repairs, navigate local regulations and permit requirements, and manage the financial aspects of property ownership, including cash flow optimization and tax planning strategies. The building performed exactly as I had projected during my analysis. Rental income remained stable, with only one tenant turnover that was filled quickly at market rates. Property expenses were consistent with my budgets, and the neighborhood continued showing positive development trends that supported property value appreciation. By the end of my first year as a property owner, I had achieved positive cash flow of $9,600 and property appreciation of approximately $45,000, representing a total return of $54,600 on my initial investment of $82,000. This 67% first-year return validated my investment analysis and provided the foundation for expanding my real estate portfolio through reinvestment of profits and strategic use of property equity. However, the most significant benefit of this first investment wasn't the immediate financial returns, but rather the credibility and experience it provided for pursuing additional investment opportunities. Having successfully completed a complex seller-financed acquisition and demonstrated competent property management capabilities, I had established myself as a serious investor worthy of consideration for other off-market opportunities. The success of my first investment property also provided psychological validation that my unconventional career path and investment strategy were viable alternatives to the traditional professional advancement that my family expected and valued. While my siblings were building their careers through promotion within established corporate structures, I was building wealth through asset accumulation and strategic investment that would eventually provide financial independence regardless of employment income. The foundation phase of my real estate investment career concluded with the recognition that systematic property acquisition and strategic financing could create substantial wealth over time, but that success would require patience, discipline, and continued expansion of my investment knowledge and market connections. The stage was set for the systematic expansion phase that would transform my single property investment into a substantial real estate portfolio that no one in my family suspected or understood. The success of my first investment property created a psychological shift that was both exhilarating and isolating. While I was experiencing the satisfaction of validated strategic thinking and growing financial confidence, I was simultaneously becoming more distant from my family's understanding of success and achievement. The gap between my actual progress and their perception of my life situation was widening in ways that would eventually create the dramatic revelation that occurred years later at Romano's restaurant. By the spring of 2016, 18 months after acquiring the Lincoln Park building, I had accumulated enough equity and cash flow to begin seriously pursuing my second investment opportunity. The first property had appreciated to approximately $920,000 while generating consistent monthly cash flow that I had been systematically saving for reinvestment rather than lifestyle expenses. This disciplined approach to profit reinvestment was creating accelerated wealth accumulation that compounded my investment capabilities exponentially. My growing expertise in seller financing arrangements had also attracted attention from other property owners who were facing similar tax and estate planning challenges. Word-of-mouth referrals from Mrs. Chen and colleagues at Henderson and Associates were generating opportunities to analyze potential deals that weren't available through traditional real estate marketing channels. The second property I acquired was significantly larger and more complex than my first investment, representing a major step up in both scale and strategic sophistication. The opportunity came through Janet Williams, a senior commercial agent at Henderson and Associates, who had developed a relationship with the estate of Robert Patterson, a prominent Chicago businessman who had died unexpectedly, leaving his family with substantial real estate holdings that needed to be liquidated to pay estate taxes and distribute assets among multiple heirs. One of Patterson's properties was a 12-unit apartment building in Wicker Park that the estate needed to sell quickly to meet tax obligations and settlement deadlines. The building was valued at approximately $1.8 million, but the estate was motivated to accept offers that could close rapidly with minimal contingencies rather than maximize sale price through extended marketing periods. The building was particularly attractive because it was located in a neighborhood experiencing rapid gentrification, with new restaurants, boutique shops, and young professional residents transforming the area from working class to trendy and expensive. The existing rental rates were below current market levels, suggesting immediate opportunities for income optimization through strategic renovations and tenant turnover management. However, acquiring this property would require substantially more sophisticated financing than my first investment. The estate wanted a quick closing with significant cash down payment, and traditional bank financing would involve lengthy approval processes that didn't meet their timeline requirements. I developed a creative financing structure that combined multiple funding sources to make the acquisition possible while minimizing my personal cash investment. The strategy involved using the equity in my first property as collateral for a bridge loan that would provide the down payment, while simultaneously arranging traditional bank financing for the majority of the purchase price. The bridge loan was arranged through Marcus Financial, a private lending firm that specialized in short-term real estate financing for investors who needed rapid access to capital for time-sensitive opportunities. The terms were expensive, 12% interest for 6 months, but the loan was secured by my first property, which had appreciated enough to provide substantial equity for collateral purposes. The permanent financing was structured as a commercial mortgage through First National Bank, where I had developed a relationship with Lisa Rodriguez, a commercial lending officer who understood real estate investment and appreciated my track record with the first property. The bank loan covered 75% of the purchase price at 5.5% interest over 25 years, leaving me with a manageable monthly payment that would be covered by rental income. The acquisition closed in August 2016, making me the owner of 18 rental units across 2 properties with a combined value of approximately $2.8 million. The monthly rental income from both buildings totaled $11,400, while the combined mortgage payments were $8,200, providing positive cash flow of $3,200 before expenses. More importantly, both properties were appreciating rapidly due to neighborhood development trends that I had identified through my market analysis. The Lincoln Park building was benefiting from continued gentrification and proximity to new retail developments, while the Wicker Park property was positioned perfectly to capitalize on the area's transformation into a destination for young professionals and creative industry workers. The success of these first 2 investments established my credibility within Chicago's real estate investment community and created opportunities for increasingly sophisticated deals. Other investors began approaching me with partnership opportunities, and property owners were referring potential seller financing situations that required the kind of creative problem-solving and relationship management that had become my specialty. However, managing an expanding real estate portfolio while maintaining my full-time position at Henderson & Associates was becoming increasingly challenging. The demands of property management, tenant relations, maintenance coordination, and financial oversight required substantial time and attention that competed with my employment responsibilities. The solution I developed was to transition from direct property management to a supervisory role that leveraged professional property management companies while maintaining strategic control over investment decisions and major operational issues. This approach allowed me to scale my portfolio without being overwhelmed by day-to-day management tasks. I engaged Premium Property Management, a boutique firm that specialized in managing small to medium-sized apartment buildings for individual investors. Their fee structure was 8% of gross rental income, which was higher than larger management companies, but they provided personalized service and sophisticated financial reporting that justified the premium cost. This transition to professional property management was crucial for enabling the next phase of my investment strategy, which focused on identifying and acquiring properties that required renovation and repositioning to optimize rental income and property values. These value-add investments required more intensive analysis and project management, but offered substantially higher returns than stabilized properties. My third major acquisition came in early 2017 when I identified a 6-unit building in Logan Square that was being sold by an elderly owner who had deferred maintenance for several years due to health issues and financial constraints. The building was structurally sound, but needed comprehensive updates to electrical, plumbing, and interior finishes to justify market-rate rents. The purchase price was $680,000, reflecting the property's condition and the substantial renovation investment required. However, my analysis indicated that a $120,000 renovation budget would enable rental rate increases from an average of $1,200 per unit to $1,800 per unit, while also increasing the building's value to approximately $1.1 million. This renovation project required coordinating multiple contractors, obtaining necessary permits, managing tenant relocations during construction, and overseeing quality control throughout the improvement process. The complexity was substantially greater than my previous acquisitions, but the potential returns justified the additional effort and risk. The renovation was completed in October 2017, and the results exceeded my projections. The updated units, rented quickly at an average of $1,850 per month, while the building's appraised value increased to $115 million. The project generated approximately $280,000 in added property value, while increasing annual rental income by $46,800. By the end of 2017, 3 years after my first property purchase, I owned 3 apartment buildings containing 24 rental units with a combined value of approximately $4.1 million. The monthly rental income totaled $19,200, while mortgage payments were $13,400, providing positive cash flow of $5,800 before management fees and operating expenses. The net monthly cash flow after all expenses was approximately $4,200, representing passive income of over $50,000 annually from my real estate investments. This income was in addition to my salary from Henderson & Associates, creating total annual income that exceeded $92,000 while building substantial net worth through property appreciation. However, the most significant aspect of this portfolio, growth wasn't the immediate financial returns, but rather the foundation it provided for accelerated expansion through strategic use of property equity and reinvestment of cash flow. The appreciation in property values had created over $800,000 in equity that could be leveraged for additional acquisitions, while the cash flow provided substantial funds for down payments on future investments. During family gatherings throughout this period, I maintained a deliberately low profile about my real estate activities. When asked about my career progress, I would mention my continued employment at Henderson & Associates and occasional references to a couple of rental properties, without providing details about the scope or success of my investments. This discretion served multiple purposes. First, it avoided family scrutiny and advice about investment risks or strategic decisions that they wouldn't understand or appreciate. Second, it prevented potential requests for financial assistance or investment participation that could complicate family relationships. Third, it maintained operational security for my business activities, which often involved confidential negotiations and sensitive financial information. My family's perception during this period was that I was making modest progress in a respectable but unexciting career while dabbling in small-scale real estate investment as a side activity. They had no understanding of the substantial wealth I was accumulating or the sophisticated business operations I was managing behind the scenes. The contrast between my actual situation and their perception was becoming increasingly dramatic, setting the stage for the eventual revelation that would fundamentally change our family dynamics. While they continued to view me as the family member who hadn't quite figured out her life, I was systematically building a real estate empire that would eventually include properties they knew intimately but never suspected I owned. By early 2018, my real estate portfolio had reached a scale that was generating opportunities I couldn't have imagined when I purchased that first 6-unit building from Mrs. Chen. The success of my value-add renovation strategy with the Logan Square property had attracted attention from other investors and real estate professionals who were beginning to view me as someone capable of handling increasingly complex and lucrative deals. The pivotal moment came through an unexpected connection that would fundamentally change both the scale of my operations and my relationship with my family, though the latter consequence wouldn't become apparent until much later. The opportunity originated from David Chen, Mrs. Chen's nephew, who had been following my progress through his aunt's glowing reports about my property management and the respectful way I had handled their family's real estate transaction. David was a corporate attorney specializing in real estate development and investment structures for institutional clients. His firm, Morrison & Associates, represented pension funds, insurance companies, and high-net-worth family offices that were seeking diversified investment opportunities in Chicago's rapidly appreciating residential real estate market. During a coffee meeting in March 2018, David explained that one of his clients, Meridian Capital Partners, was looking for local investment partners who could identify, acquire, and manage residential properties that met their specific investment criteria. They were particularly interested in apartment buildings with 20-50 units in gentrifying neighborhoods that offered opportunities for value enhancement through strategic renovations and improved management. The partnership structure David proposed was compelling but complex. Meridian would provide 80% of the acquisition and renovation capital for qualified deals, while I would contribute 20% equity and take responsibility for property identification. acquisition negotiations, renovation, management, and ongoing operations. Profits would be split 60% to Meridian and 40% to me, but I would also receive acquisition fees and ongoing management compensation that would provide substantial income regardless of property performance. This partnership opportunity represented a quantum leap in scale and sophistication that would require transitioning from individual property investments to institutional quality operations, with professional systems, detailed reporting requirements, and significantly higher stakes for both success and failure. The first test case for this partnership was a 28-unit apartment complex in Pilsen that was being marketed by the estate of another deceased property owner. The building was similar to my previous acquisitions in terms of deferred maintenance and below-market rents, but the scale was substantially larger and the renovation requirements more comprehensive. The asking price was $3.2 million for a property. That could be worth $4.8 million after renovation, but the project would require approximately $800,000 in improvement investments and 6 months of intensive construction management. The financial analysis indicated potential returns that justified the risk, but the complexity would test every skill I had developed over the previous 4 years. Meridian's due diligence process was exhaustive and professional in ways that far exceeded anything I had experienced with my individual investments. Their team included architects, construction managers, market analysts, and financial experts who conducted detailed evaluations of every aspect of the proposed investment. The approval process took 6 weeks and required me to present comprehensive analyses of the property, neighborhood, renovation plans, financial projections, and management strategies to a committee of senior investment professionals who evaluated deals worth tens of millions of dollars on a regular basis. When Meridian approved the investment in May 2018, I experienced a mixture of excitement and terror that reflected the magnitude of responsibility I was accepting. Success with this project would establish my credibility for pursuing similar partnerships and potentially accessing hundreds of millions of dollars in investment capital. Failure would likely end my real estate career and result in substantial, personal financial losses. The acquisition closed in June 2018, and the renovation project began immediately. Managing a construction project of this scale required capabilities I had never developed, including coordination of multiple contractor teams, management of complex permitting requirements, and oversight of quality control processes that affected 28 separate residential units. The project also required relocating existing tenants during renovation periods, which involved temporary housing arrangements, rent reductions, and extensive communication to maintain positive relationships throughout the disruption. These human factors were often more challenging than the construction management aspects, requiring diplomatic skills and creative problem-solving that couldn't be learned through technical training. The renovation was completed in December 2018, 2 weeks ahead of schedule and $15,000 under budget. The updated units began leasing immediately at rental rates that exceeded our projections, while the building's appraised value came in at $4.9 million, slightly above our target. The success of this first institutional partnership project validated my operational capabilities and established the foundation for expanding my collaboration with Meridian Capital Partners. Over the following 18 months, we completed 3 additional acquisition and renovation projects, each larger and more complex than the previous one. By the end of 2019, I was managing a portfolio of 7 buildings containing 142 rental units with a combined value of approximately $18.7 million. The cash flow from these properties was generating over $180,000 annually in passive income, while my acquisition fees and management compensation from the Meridian partnership were providing additional income of approximately $240,000 per year. However, the most significant development during this period wasn't the financial success, but rather the strategic decision I made to leave Henderson and Associates and establish Morrison Properties as an independent real estate investment and management company. The transition to full-time entrepreneurship was both liberating and terrifying. While I had achieved financial independence through my real estate investments, establishing a legitimate business operation required developing new capabilities in areas ranging from corporate structure and legal compliance to marketing and business development. The business incorporation process was handled by David Chen's firm, which helped establish the legal and operational frameworks necessary for managing institutional partnerships and individual client relationships. Morrison Properties was structured as a limited liability company that could accept outside investment capital while providing appropriate liability protection and tax efficiency for my business operations. The office space I leased was in River, North, a prestigious business district that would provide the professional image necessary for attracting high-quality clients and investment partners. The 2,400-square-foot suite included conference rooms for client meetings, office space for the 2 employees I hired to handle administrative and analytical functions, and storage for the extensive documentation required for managing multiple property investments. My family's reaction to my transition from corporate employment to entrepreneurship was predictably mixed. The announcement that I was starting my own real estate company generated initial surprise and cautious support, but the details of my business model and investment activities remained largely mysterious to them. When they asked about my new company, I provided general descriptions of real estate investment and property management services, without revealing the scale of my operations or the institutional partnerships that were generating substantial income. This discretion continued the pattern of maintaining separation between my actual business success and their perception of my career progress. The family dynamic during this period reflected their continued uncertainty about my life choices and career trajectory. While leaving a stable corporate job to start a business demonstrated ambition and confidence, they remained skeptical about real estate investment as a legitimate wealth-building strategy. My mother expressed particular concern about the risks of entrepreneurship and the challenges of building a successful business without the security of corporate employment. "Jessica, you had a good job with benefits and stability. Starting your own business is always risky, especially in real estate. What if the market changes? What if you can't find enough clients?" These concerns reflected genuine care for my welfare, but they also revealed fundamental misunderstanding of my actual situation and capabilities. While they viewed my entrepreneurial transition as a risky career change that might or might not succeed, I was actually formalizing business operations that were already generating substantial income and managing millions of dollars in real estate assets. The gap between their perception and reality was becoming increasingly dramatic. Though none of us recognized how significant this disconnect had become, or how it would eventually create the circumstances for a profound family revelation. By the end of 2019, I had established Morrison Properties as a legitimate real estate investment company with institutional partnerships, professional operations, and substantial asset management responsibilities. The business was generating over $400,000 in annual income while building long-term wealth through property appreciation and equity accumulation. However, my family continued to view me as the member who was still figuring out her career path and hadn't achieved the kind of obvious professional success that characterized my siblings' accomplishments. This perception would persist for several more years, creating the conditions for the dramatic revelation that would eventually reshape our entire family dynamic. The year 2020 brought unprecedented challenges to the real estate market that would have destroyed many investors, but for Morrison Properties, it created the opportunity of a lifetime. While the COVID-19 pandemic was causing widespread economic disruption and forcing many property owners into distressed sales, my conservative financial management and strong relationships with institutional partners positioned me perfectly to capitalize on market dislocations that other investors couldn't navigate. The crown jewel opportunity emerged in September 2020, during the height of market uncertainty, when many investors were pulling back from new acquisitions due to concerns about rental income stability and property value volatility. The deal came through Patricia Rodriguez, a commercial broker who had been following my success with Meridian Capital Partners and knew I had access to capital and operational capabilities that could handle complex, distressed situations. The property was Riverside Gardens, a 48-unit apartment complex in Lincoln Park that had been owned by the Brennan family for over 30 years. The complex was one of the most desirable rental properties in the neighborhood, featuring spacious 2- and 3-bedroom units with parking, laundry facilities, and a small courtyard that created a residential community atmosphere that was rare for urban rental housing. However, the Brennan family was facing a perfect storm of financial pressures that made immediate sale necessary despite the property's inherent value and income potential. The family patriarch, Thomas Brennan, had died in March 2020, leaving his widow Catherine to manage both the property and the estate settlement process during the most challenging period in recent real estate history. Catherine Brennan was 78 years old and had no experience with property management or real estate investment. The complex had been managed by her late husband with assistance from a part-time maintenance supervisor, but the systems were informal and the financial records were incomplete. The pandemic had created additional challenges with tenant payment issues, maintenance complications, and regulatory restrictions that made professional management essential. The estate also faced substantial tax obligations that required liquidity. While Catherine's adult children were scattered across the country with their own careers and families, making collaborative property management impossible. The family needed a buyer who could close quickly, handle the complex tenant and operational issues, and provide certainty during an uncertain market period. The asking price was $7.8 million, reflecting both the property's prime location and the urgency of the family's situation. However, my analysis indicated that the property was worth closer to $9.5 million based on comparable sales and rental income potential, suggesting an opportunity for substantial immediate equity creation. Through strategic acquisition, the complexity came from the property's operational challenges and the financing requirements during a period when traditional commercial lenders were restricting real estate lending due to pandemic-related uncertainties. Most conventional buyers couldn't obtain financing quickly enough to meet the family's timeline, while cash buyers were demanding substantial price reductions to compensate for market risks. I developed a creative acquisition strategy that addressed the family's needs, while positioning Morrison Properties for exceptional returns. The approach involved combining private capital from Meridian Partners with a bridge loan secured by my existing property portfolio, enabling a rapid closing that provided the Brennan family with certainty while preserving the property's full value potential. The private capital component totaled $6 million, representing Meridian's largest single investment in our partnership to date. The bridge loan provided an additional $2.2 million secured by equity in my existing properties, creating total acquisition capital of $8.2 million that allowed for a purchase price of $7.8 million plus closing costs and immediate working capital for property improvements. The closing took place in November 2020, making Morrison Properties the owner of Chicago's premier mid-sized apartment complex in one of the city's most desirable neighborhoods. The acquisition represented a quantum leap in both scale and strategic significance that established my company as a major player in Chicago's residential real estate investment market. However, the real strategic brilliance of this acquisition wouldn't become apparent until several years later, when I discovered that one of the property's long-term tenants was my own mother. Linda Morrison had been living in Unit 3B at Riverside Gardens since 2012, when she moved there after my father's death. The unit was a spacious 2-bedroom apartment with updated kitchen and bathroom, hardwood floors, and a view of the courtyard that she had always praised for its peaceful, residential atmosphere despite being in the heart of the city. My mother had never mentioned the name of her building or provided the specific address during family conversations about her living situation. When she discussed her apartment, She would reference my building in Lincoln Park, or the place near the park, without providing details that would have enabled me to identify the specific property. The discovery occurred during my first comprehensive review of tenant records and lease agreements in December 2020. As I was analyzing the building's rental history and tenant demographics, I encountered a lease agreement for Linda Morrison in Unit 3B, with a monthly rent of $2,400 and a lease renewal date of March 2021. The initial shock of recognizing my mother's name was followed by a complex mixture of emotions ranging from amusement to strategic opportunity recognition. My mother, who had been living in one of my properties for over a year without knowing it, was now in the position of having her disappointing daughter as her landlord, while continuing to express concerns about my career choices and financial stability. The irony was compounded by the fact that my mother had frequently complained about property management issues during her previous 8 years of tenancy under the Brennan family ownership. Her complaints typically focused on slow response times for maintenance requests, inconsistent communication from management, and what she perceived as neglect of common areas and building improvements. These complaints had often been shared during family dinners as evidence of the challenges of rental housing and the importance of homeownership for building financial security. "Jessica, you really should consider buying a place instead of dealing with landlords who don't care about maintaining their properties properly," she would say, apparently unaware that her advice was being given to someone who owned significantly more real estate than anyone else in the family. The strategic decision I faced was whether to reveal my ownership immediately or to maintain confidentiality while implementing property improvements that would enhance her living experience without her knowledge of the connection. I chose the latter approach for several reasons that would prove crucial for the eventual family revelation. First, maintaining operational confidentiality allowed me to address the legitimate maintenance and management issues that had affected all tenants, including my mother, without creating the potential awkwardness of family relationships influencing business decisions. I could implement professional property management improvements based on objective business criteria rather than personal considerations. Second, the confidentiality preserved the natural opportunity for a dramatic revelation at an appropriate future moment when the contrast between my mother's perception of my capabilities and the reality of my success would create maximum impact for reshaping family dynamics. Third, the situation provided valuable insights into my mother's actual living situation, financial circumstances, and daily concerns that weren't typically shared during family gatherings. Understanding her perspective as a tenant would inform both my business operations and my approach to eventual family conversations about money, success, and independence. The property management improvements I implemented at Riverside Gardens during the first 6 months of ownership were comprehensive and professional in ways that transformed the tenant experience. I hired Metropolitan Property Services, Chicago's most respected residential property management firm, to handle day-to-day operations with standards that exceeded typical apartment building management. The improvements included upgraded security, systems, renovated common areas, enhanced landscaping, more responsive maintenance protocols, and upgraded amenities that created a luxury residential experience. The total investment in building improvements was $320,000 during the first year, funded through cash flow and strategic financing that positioned the property for substantial rent increases and value appreciation. My mother's response to these improvements was enthusiastic and frequently shared during family gatherings. "You wouldn't believe how much better my building has become since the new owners took over," she would say. "They actually care about maintaining the property and responding to tenant concerns. It's like living in a completely different building." These comments were particularly ironic given her continued concerns about my career choices and financial stability. She was praising the property management capabilities of her daughter, while simultaneously expressing doubts about that same daughter's business acumen and professional success. The operational success of Riverside Gardens exceeded all projections. During the first year of ownership, Occupancy remained at 100% despite the challenging market conditions, while rental income increased by 18% through strategic lease renewals and unit improvements. The property's appraised value increased to $10.8 million by the end of 2021, creating over $3 million in equity appreciation within the first year of ownership. More importantly, the success established Morrison Properties as Chicago's premier boutique residential investment firm, attracting attention from additional institutional partners and creating opportunities for even larger and more sophisticated deals. The company's portfolio had grown to over 200 rental units, with a combined value exceeding $28 million, generating annual cash flow of over $650,000 while building substantial long-term wealth through property appreciation. However, the most significant impact of the Riverside Gardens acquisition was the strategic positioning it created for the eventual family revelation that would fundamentally change how my mother and siblings understood my capabilities, success, and place within the family hierarchy. The period from 2021 to 2023 marked a curious paradox in my relationship with my family. While Morrison Properties was experiencing unprecedented growth and success, my family's perception of my life trajectory was becoming increasingly critical and concerned. The disconnect between reality and their understanding had reached levels that were both amusing and deeply frustrating, creating psychological pressure that would eventually contribute to the explosive revelation that occurred at Romano's restaurant. The criticism intensified during family gatherings throughout 2021, often triggered by comparisons to my siblings' more visible and conventional achievements. Michael had been promoted to senior partner at his prestigious law firm, a position that came with substantial prestige, a corner office overlooking Lake Michigan, and regular mentions in legal publications that my parents proudly shared with their social circle. Sarah's marketing agency had expanded to represent several Fortune 500 companies, generating revenues that enabled her to purchase a sprawling suburban home in Winnetka and enroll her children in exclusive private schools that reinforced the family's upwardly mobile aspirations. Her success was tangible and easily understood by family members who could point to her beautiful home, luxury vehicles, and active social media presence as evidence of professional achievement. In contrast, my success remained largely invisible to family observation. While I was managing a real estate portfolio worth tens of millions of dollars and generating substantial personal income, the nature of my business made these achievements difficult to display or explain in ways that impressed relatives who measured success through traditional markers of wealth and status. My decision to maintain a relatively modest personal lifestyle, despite my growing wealth, contributed to their misperception of my situation. Rather than purchasing expensive homes, luxury cars, or designer clothing that would signal financial success, I was reinvesting profits into property acquisitions and business expansion that built long-term wealth while maintaining operational flexibility for future opportunities. This conservative approach to personal spending was strategically sound from a business perspective, but it meant that family members saw few external indicators of the financial success I was achieving. My apartment was comfortable but unremarkable, my car was reliable but not impressive, and my clothing was professional but not luxurious. The family criticism reached new levels during Thanksgiving 2021, when my mother decided to address what she perceived as my lack of direction and achievement in front of the entire extended family. The conversation began during dessert, when various family members were sharing updates about their children's accomplishments and career progress. "I just don't understand what Jessica is doing with her life," my mother announced to the assembled relatives, her voice carrying the tone of disappointed concern that had become familiar over the years. "She's 34 years old, still renting an apartment, driving that old Honda, and working in some real estate business that nobody really understands. Meanwhile, Michael is building a distinguished legal career, and Sarah has created a successful company with real employees and impressive clients." The comparison was particularly painful, because it reflected my mother's complete failure to recognize the scope and sophistication of Morrison Properties operations. When she referenced some real estate business that nobody really understands, she was describing a company that managed over $35 million in real estate assets, employed 12 people, and maintained partnerships with institutional investors managing billions of dollars in capital. My Aunt Patricia joined the conversation, with her own observations about my apparent lack of progress. Jessica has always been bright, but she seems to lack the ambition and focus that Michael and Sarah have shown. Maybe she needs to consider a more stable career path, something with a regular salary and benefits that would provide better security for her future. These comments reflected not only misunderstanding of my actual situation, but also fundamental ignorance about entrepreneurship, real estate investment, and wealth-building strategies that didn't conform to traditional employment models. The suggestion that I needed better security for my future was being made to someone whose net worth exceeded $8 million and whose passive income was approaching $800,000 annually. The psychological impact of these family gatherings was complex and increasingly difficult to manage. On one hand, I found dark humor in the dramatic irony of being criticized for lack of financial stability by people who had no understanding of my actual circumstances. On the other hand, the constant negativity and dismissal were emotionally exhausting and created growing resentment about their inability to recognize or appreciate my achievements. The situation was further complicated by my mother's continued praise for her living situation at Riverside Gardens, which she attributed to enlightened property management by owners who clearly understood how to maintain quality residential properties. During the same Thanksgiving dinner where she criticized my career prospects, she spent 15 minutes describing the excellent service and property improvements that had made her apartment building the best-managed property in Lincoln Park. "You should see how responsive the management company is," she told the family. "When I submitted a maintenance request for my kitchen faucet, they had someone there the next day with high-quality fixtures. The new owners obviously understand that maintaining property value requires treating tenants well and keeping everything in excellent condition." The irony of receiving property management praise from my mother while simultaneously being criticized for my career choices was both amusing and infuriating. She was unknowingly describing the professional excellence of her daughter's business operations while expressing concern about that same daughter's ability to manage her own life effectively. Throughout 2022, the family criticism expanded beyond general concerns about my career direction to include specific advice about life choices that reflected their fundamental misunderstanding of my situation. My mother began suggesting that I should consider returning to corporate employment for stability and benefits, apparently unaware that Morrison Properties provided me with significantly more financial security than any corporate position could offer. Sarah offered to help me network within her professional circle to identify marketing or business development opportunities that might provide better career prospects than whatever it is you're doing in real estate. The condescending tone of this offer was particularly galling, given that my business relationships included institutional investors and commercial real estate professionals, whose networks far exceeded anything her marketing agency could provide. Michael suggested that I should consider pursuing an MBA to add credibility to your business activities and provide better strategic thinking capabilities. This advice was being offered to someone who was already implementing sophisticated financial strategies and managing complex business operations that required exactly the kind of strategic thinking that business schools attempt to teach theoretically. Taturi. Culmination of this period came during Christmas dinner 2022, when my mother made the decision to stage what amounted to a family intervention about my life choices. She had apparently been discussing her concerns about me with other family members, and had concluded that direct confrontation was necessary to motivate me toward more appropriate career decisions. "Jessica, we need to have a serious conversation about your future," she began, her tone suggesting that this was an issue that had been weighing heavily on her mind. You're 35 years old, and you're still living like someone in their 20s. No real career progression, no significant relationships, no evidence that you're building toward anything substantial. We're all concerned that you're wasting your potential and making choices that you'll regret when you're older. The intervention continued with contributions from various family members who shared their observations about my apparent lack of direction and their suggestions for corrective actions. The conversation lasted over an hour and covered everything from my living situation and personal relationships to my career choices and financial planning. Throughout this discussion, I maintained external composure while internally marveling at the complete disconnect between their perceptions and reality. They were expressing concern about my financial security to someone whose liquid net worth exceeded the combined assets of everyone else at the table. They were worried about my lack of career progression while speaking to someone who had built a business that generated more annual income than any of their professional salaries. The psychological pressure of maintaining this facade was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. While I had originally maintained confidentiality about my success to avoid family complications and preserve operational security, the constant criticism and dismissal were creating emotional costs that were beginning to outweigh the strategic benefits of secrecy. However, I was also beginning to recognize that the dramatic contrast between their perceptions and reality was creating the foundation for a revelation that could fundamentally reshape family dynamics in ways that would benefit everyone's understanding of success, achievement, and the various paths to financial independence. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would transform their understanding of who I was and what I had accomplished. But the timing and circumstances of that revelation would need to be carefully orchestrated to achieve maximum impact while preserving family relationships that remained important despite their current dysfunction. The beginning of 2023 marked a crucial turning point for Morrison Properties that would set the stage for the most significant expansion phase in the company's history. While my family continued their pattern of concern and criticism about my apparent lack of direction, I was quietly building strategic partnerships and alliance networks that would multiply my investment capabilities by orders of magnitude. The catalyst for this expansion came through an unexpected connection at the Chicago Real Estate Investment Summit in February 2023. The conference was an exclusive gathering of institutional investors, family offices, and sophisticated individual investors who controlled billions of dollars in real estate capital. My invitation to speak on a panel about boutique investment strategies in urban markets represented recognition of Morrison Properties' success and my growing reputation within Chicago's professional real estate community. During the networking reception following my presentation, I was approached by Catherine Walsh, the Chief Investment Officer for the Steinberg Family Office, one of Chicago's oldest and most prestigious wealth management organizations. The Steinberg family had built their fortune through manufacturing and real estate development over 4 generations, accumulating assets that now exceeded $2 billion under professional management. Catherine explained that the Steinberg family was seeking to diversify their real estate holdings beyond their traditional focus on commercial office buildings and retail centers. They were particularly interested in residential investment opportunities that could provide stable cash flow while benefiting from Chicago's continued population growth and urban development trends. However, the family's investment criteria required partnerships with operators who could demonstrate sophisticated market knowledge, proven management capabilities, and the operational infrastructure necessary for managing large-scale residential portfolios. Their minimum investment threshold was $25 million, representing a scale that would require me to expand Morrison Properties' capabilities dramatically. The partnership opportunity Catherine proposed was both thrilling and intimidating. The Steinbergs' family office would provide up to $100 million in investment capital over 3 years for residential acquisition and development projects that met their return and risk criteria. Morrison Properties would identify opportunities, manage acquisitions, oversee property improvements, and handle ongoing operations in exchange for acquisition fees, management compensation, and equity participation in each deal. This partnership would transform Morrison Properties from a successful boutique investment firm into one of Chicago's major residential real estate operators, with the potential to control over $150 million in property assets within 5 years. However, it would also require building institutional quality operations, systems, and personnel that could handle the complexity and scale of managing investments for ultra-high net worth families. The due diligence process for establishing this partnership was exhaustive and lasted 4 months. The Steinberg family's investment committee required detailed analysis of Morrison Properties' track record, financial statements, operational procedures, market positioning, and strategic vision for scaling the business to institutional levels. Had to present to a committee that included 3 generations of family members, their chief financial officer, outside investment consultants, and legal advisors who specialized in complex partnership structures. The presentations covered everything from my personal background and investment philosophy to detailed financial modeling of projected returns under various market scenarios. The process was simultaneously the most challenging and most validating experience of my professional career. These were individuals who routinely evaluated investment opportunities worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and their decision to partner with Morrison Properties represented institutional validation of everything I had built over the previous 9 years. The partnership agreement was finalized in June 2023, providing Morrison Properties with access to $100 million in investment capital and establishing the company as a major player in Chicago's residential investment market. The signing ceremony took place in the Steinberg family office's conference room overlooking Millennium Park, with legal representatives from both sides documenting one of the largest residential real estate partnerships in Chicago's recent history. However, the most ironic aspect of this achievement was that it coincided with my family's continued concerns about my career prospects and financial stability. The same week that Morrison Properties closed a $100 million institutional partnership, my mother called to express worry about my lack of progress in building a stable career foundation. The first major acquisition under the Steinberg partnership was a portfolio of 4 apartment buildings in Lakeview that were being sold by an institutional owner who was liquidating Chicago properties to focus on other markets. The portfolio contained 156 units with a combined value of $32 million, representing exactly the kind of scale and quality that institutional investors required. The acquisition process was complex, involving detailed due diligence on each property, comprehensive financial analysis, coordination with multiple legal and financial advisors, and negotiations that addressed everything from environmental assessments to tenant lease assignments. The transaction required 6 weeks to complete and involved documentation that filled several storage boxes. More importantly, the acquisition required Morrison Properties to expand our operational capabilities dramatically. I hired Jennifer Martinez as Director of Operations, bringing her 15 years of experience managing large residential portfolios for institutional owners. I also engaged Premium Asset Management to handle day-to-day property operations while maintaining strategic oversight and decision-making authority. The portfolio acquisition closed in September 2023, making Morrison Properties the owner or operator of over 350 rental units with a combined value exceeding $67 million. The monthly rental income from these properties totaled over $185,000, while the management fees and equity participation provided Morrison Properties with annual income approaching $1.2 million. However, managing this expanded portfolio required developing systems and procedures that could handle the complexity of institutional quality operations while maintaining the personalized service and attention to detail that had built our reputation with individual investors and property owners. The operational expansion included implementing new property management software that could track maintenance, tenant communications, financial reporting, and regulatory compliance across multiple properties simultaneously. We also established relationships with specialized contractors, legal advisors, and financial services providers who could support the scale and complexity of our operations. During this same period, my personal living situation had become another source of family concern and criticism. While I was managing tens of millions of dollars in real estate assets, I continued living in a modest two-bedroom apartment that I had rented since 2019. The apartment was comfortable and well located, but it hardly reflected the financial success that my business achievements represented. My decision to maintain this living arrangement was strategic rather than financial. Purchasing an expensive personal residence would tie up capital that could be deployed more profitably in real estate investments, while also creating additional complexity for business operations that required flexibility and focus on professional, rather than personal real estate decisions. However, my family interpreted this choice as evidence of my continued inability to achieve the kind of financial stability that would enable homeownership. During family gatherings throughout 2023, my living situation became a frequent topic of concern and advice about the importance of building equity through homeownership and establishing roots in the community. The irony of receiving homeownership advice from family members while managing a portfolio that included their own apartment building was becoming increasingly absurd. My mother continued praising the excellent management of Riverside Gardens, while simultaneously expressing concern that her daughter hadn't achieved sufficient financial stability to purchase her own home. The psychological pressure of maintaining this facade was intensifying as the gap between reality and perception reached almost comical proportions. I was receiving business development advice from siblings whose annual incomes were less than my monthly cash flow, while listening to concerns about my financial security from a mother whose rent was generating profit for my investment company. Chucky. Situation reached a breaking point during my nephew's high school graduation party in May 2023, when several family members decided to stage another intervention about my life choices. The conversation took place in my brother Michael's backyard, with various relatives offering their perspectives on my apparent lack of progress and their suggestions for corrective action. Jessica, we're all concerned that you're not building anything lasting, my Aunt Patricia explained, her tone suggesting genuine care mixed with frustration. You're almost 36 years old, and you don't own a home. You're not married, and this real estate business doesn't seem to be providing the kind of stability that would enable you to plan for the future. The intervention continued with similar themes from other family members, each expressing concern about different aspects of my apparent failure to achieve traditional markers of adult success. The conversation lasted over 2 hours and covered topics ranging from my living situation and relationship status to retirement planning and healthcare coverage. Throughout this discussion, I maintained external composure while internally calculating that my net worth now exceeded $12 million, and my annual income was approaching $1.5 million through various business activities. The family members who were expressing concern about my financial planning were collectively worth less than my liquid assets alone. However, I was also beginning to recognize that this dramatic contrast between perception and reality was creating the perfect foundation for a revelation that would fundamentally reshape family dynamics while providing important lessons about success, achievement, and the various paths to financial independence that don't conform to traditional expectations. The summer and fall of 2023 represented the final phase of my double life, as the gap between my family's perception and my actual circumstances reached levels that were becoming psychologically unsustainable. While Morrison Properties was experiencing its most successful period ever, the emotional toll of constant family criticism and the pressure of maintaining operational secrecy was creating internal tension that demanded resolution. The business success during this period was extraordinary, by any measure. The Steinberg Family Office Partnership had accelerated our acquisition capabilities beyond my most optimistic projections, while our operational excellence was attracting additional institutional investors who wanted access to Chicago's residential real estate market through proven local operators. In August 2023, Morrison Properties completed the acquisition of Harbor Point Towers, a 78-unit luxury apartment complex in River North that represented our entry into high-end residential investment. The property required a $18 million acquisition price, but offered rental rates that averaged $3,200 per unit and attracted young professionals who valued premium amenities and prime downtown location. The Harbor Point acquisition was particularly significant because it demonstrated Morrison Properties' ability to succeed across different market segments, from affordable housing renovation projects to luxury residential properties serving Chicago's most affluent renters. This diversification strategy was essential for building sustainable long-term growth while managing market risks that could affect any single property category. More importantly, the Harbor Point acquisition brought our total portfolio to over 430 rental units with a combined value exceeding $89 million. The monthly rental income had grown to over $240,000, while our various management fees, acquisition commissions, and equity participation were generating annual income approaching $1.8 million for Morrison Properties. However, the most personally significant development during this period was completely unrelated to business expansion. In September 2023, I learned that my mother was considering moving from her apartment at Riverside Gardens to a smaller unit in a different building that would reduce her housing costs and provide better accessibility as she approached her 70th birthday. This news came during a family dinner where my mother was discussing her retirement planning and concerns about managing her expenses on a fixed income. She explained that while she loved her current apartment and appreciated the excellent management, the monthly rent of $2,400 was becoming a significant portion of her retirement budget. "I've been looking at some smaller places that would cost around $1,800 per month," she explained to the assembled family. "It would mean giving up some space and leaving this wonderful building that's been so well managed, but I need to be realistic about my financial situation and plan for the future." The family discussion that followed focused on various suggestions for helping my mother manage her housing costs, including offers from Michael and Sarah to contribute financially to enable her to remain in her current apartment. The conversation revealed details about my mother's financial situation that I hadn't previously understood, including her relatively modest retirement savings and Social Security income. What struck me most profoundly was that my mother was considering relocating to save $600 per month in housing costs, while unknowingly paying rent to a daughter whose monthly income exceeded $150,000. The mathematical absurdity of this situation was almost overwhelming, but it also crystallized my understanding of how my strategic secrecy had created emotional distance that was preventing me from providing meaningful support to family members who actually needed assistance. The realization that my mother was experiencing financial stress while living in my property, paying rent that contributed to my business profits, created a moral complexity that demanded immediate attention. However, addressing this situation would require revealing information about my business operations and property ownership that I had kept confidential for nearly a decade. During October 2023, I began developing contingency plans for various revelation scenarios that could address my mother's housing situation while managing the broader family dynamics that would inevitably result from discovering the scope of my financial success. These plans required careful consideration of timing, presentation methods, and strategic objectives for reshaping family relationships in positive directions. The planning process was complicated by the fact that any revelation about my property ownership would necessarily expose the extent of my business success, requiring explanations about everything from my partnership with institutional investors to my role in managing tens of millions of dollars in real estate assets. The family members who had been expressing concern about my financial stability would need to process the reality that I had achieved wealth and business success that exceeded their most optimistic projections. More challenging was the question of how to handle the years of criticism, interventions, and condescending advice that had characterized family interactions throughout my period of hidden success. While I didn't want to embarrass or humiliate family members who had acted with good intentions, I also needed to establish new relationship dynamics that reflected my actual capabilities and achievements rather than their outdated perceptions. The strategic planning process revealed that the revelation would need to serve multiple purposes simultaneously, providing immediate assistance with my mother's housing situation, establishing appropriate recognition of my business achievements, reshaping family dynamics to reflect current realities, and preserving relationships that remained important despite their current dysfunction. During November 2023, my mother's housing situation became more urgent when she received notice that her lease renewal for March 2024 would include a rent increase to $2,750 per month, reflecting market rate adjustments that were standard for prime Lincoln Park properties. This increase would create additional financial pressure that made her relocation plans more definitive and time-sensitive. The lease renewal notice created an immediate decision point that would require revealing my ownership or allowing my mother to relocate based on financial constraints that I could easily address. The moral complexity of this situation was compounded by business considerations about maintaining market rate pricing policies that applied equally to all tenants regardless of personal relationships. However, I also recognized that this situation provided the perfect catalyst for a revelation that could address multiple family relationship issues, while demonstrating the practical benefits of my business success in ways that would be immediately meaningful to family members who needed assistance. The final element that shaped my revelation planning was a conversation with David Chen in December 2023, during which he shared his observations about the psychological costs of maintaining extended secrecy about significant achievements. His experience with other successful entrepreneurs had shown him that strategic confidentiality could become emotionally unsustainable when it prevented authentic relationships with family members who remained important despite their misunderstandings. Jessica, you've built something remarkable that should be a source of pride and family celebration, David explained during our year-end business planning meeting. The secrecy that was strategically necessary during your early development phase may now be preventing you from enjoying the relationships and recognition that success should provide. His perspective helped me understand that my original reasons for maintaining confidentiality about my business activities, avoiding family complications, preserving operational security, and preventing requests for financial assistance, were no longer compelling enough to justify the emotional costs of continued secrecy. The psychological pressure of family interventions about my apparent lack of direction, combined with the moral complexity of my mother's housing situation, had created circumstances that demanded resolution through honest communication about my actual situation and achievements. During the final weeks of 2023, I made the strategic decision that the new year would mark the end of my double life and the beginning of authentic family relationships, based on accurate understanding of my capabilities, success, and resources. The revelation would need to be carefully orchestrated to maximize positive outcomes while minimizing potential embarrassment or relationship damage. However, the specific timing and circumstances of this revelation would be determined by family dynamics rather than my strategic planning. The opportunity for dramatic revelation would come sooner than expected, during a family dinner that was intended to celebrate my nephew's graduation, but instead became the setting for the most significant family confrontation of my adult life. 3. Stage was perfectly set for a revelation that would transform not only my family's understanding of my success, but also their appreciation for the various paths to achievement that don't conform to traditional expectations or conventional measures of professional accomplishment. March 15, 2024, started as what should have been a celebration. My nephew Tyler had just been accepted to Northwestern University with a partial academic scholarship, and my brother Michael had suggested that the family gather at Romano's, our traditional venue for marking important milestones, to celebrate this achievement and discuss Tyler's future plans. I arrived at the restaurant that evening with mixed emotions. knowing that this gathering might provide the opportunity I had been contemplating for months to finally address the massive disconnect between my family's perceptions and my actual circumstances. However, I had no intention of forcing a confrontation, and I certainly didn't anticipate that the evening would unfold in a way that would make revelation not just appropriate, but absolutely necessary. The early part of the dinner proceeded, normally, with family members congratulating Tyler on his academic success and discussing his plans for college. The conversation was warm and celebratory, focusing on Tyler's achievements and the family's pride in his accomplishments. Michael and Sarah shared stories about their own college experiences, while my parents offered advice about making the most of university opportunities. I contributed to these conversations naturally, sharing my own memories from State University, and offering encouragement about Tyler's academic and career prospects. Nothing in the early dinner conversation suggested that the evening would become the catalyst for the most dramatic family revelation in our history. The shift began during the main course, when the conversation turned to broader family updates and career developments. Michael announced that his law firm was considering him for the managing partner position, which would make him one of the youngest managing partners in the firm's history. Sarah shared news about landing a major contract with a tech startup that could triple her agency's revenue within 2 years. The pattern that emerged was familiar from countless previous family gatherings. Michael and Sarah's achievements were celebrated enthusiastically, with detailed discussions about their strategic thinking, professional capabilities, and future prospects. Their success was viewed as reflecting well on the entire family and validating our parents' emphasis on education, hard work, and strategic career development. When the conversation inevitably turned to my situation, the tone shifted noticeably. Rather than celebration or even neutral inquiry, there was an undertone of concern and barely concealed frustration that had been building throughout years of family gatherings where I had failed to provide the kind of concrete achievements that they could understand and appreciate. "And what about you, Jessica?" my mother asked, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated disappointment and worry. "Are you making any progress with your business, or are you still struggling to figure out what you want to do with your life?" The question itself wasn't unreasonable, but the framing revealed the fundamental assumptions that my family had developed about my situation. In their minds, I was someone who was still struggling to figure out my life direction, rather than someone who had built a successful business and achieved substantial financial independence through strategic real estate investment. I attempted to provide a general update about Morrison Properties' continued growth and success, explaining that we had expanded our portfolio significantly and were working with several new institutional partners. However, my description remained deliberately vague about the specific scale and financial results of our operations. "That's nice, dear," my mother responded, her tone suggesting polite interest rather than genuine enthusiasm. "But when are you going to start building something more substantial? You're 36 years old, and you're still renting an apartment and working on these small real estate projects that don't seem to be leading anywhere significant." The characterization of my work as small real estate projects that don't seem to be leading anywhere significant was so far from reality that I felt momentarily disoriented. My mother was describing a business that managed nearly $90 million in real estate assets, as if it were a hobby that I pursued in my spare time. Sarah joined the conversation with her own observations and advice. "Jessica, maybe it's time to consider whether real estate investment is really the right path for you. The market can be so unpredictable, and it seems like you're not building the kind of stable career foundation that would provide security for your future." The advice about building stable career foundation was being offered to someone whose annual income exceeded $1.8 million and whose net worth was approaching $15 million through systematic wealth accumulation over more than a decade. The gap between their perception and reality had become so extreme that meaningful communication seemed impossible without dramatic revelation. Michael contributed his own perspective about the importance of traditional career advancement and the risks of entrepreneurial ventures that didn't provide clear metrics for success and professional development. He suggested that I might benefit from pursuing an MBA or considering positions with established real estate firms that could provide mentorship and structured career progression. The cumulative effect of these well-intentioned but fundamentally misguided suggestions was creating psychological pressure that was becoming difficult to manage through continued diplomatic responses. Each family member was offering advice based on assumptions about my situation that were not merely incorrect, but completely inverted from reality. The breaking point came when my mother decided to address what she apparently viewed as the most concerning aspect of my life situation: my continued residence in a rental apartment, rather than home ownership that would demonstrate financial stability and adult responsibility. "Jessica, I've been thinking about your living situation, and I'm really concerned that you're not building any equity or establishing roots in the community," she began, her voice taking on the tone of serious maternal guidance. "You're almost 37 years old, and you're still renting that little apartment like someone in their 20s. Meanwhile, I'm living in this beautiful building with excellent management, and I see what a difference it makes to have responsible property, ownership, and professional management." The irony of receiving homeownership advice from my mother while she unknowingly lived in my building was stunning. But what came next transformed irony into something approaching the surreal. "You know what, Jessica?" my mother continued, her voice rising slightly as she warmed to her topic. "I think your problem is that you've never learned to take responsibility for building something lasting. Your brother Michael is building a distinguished legal career. Your sister Sarah has created a successful company with real employees and impressive clients, and here you are, still figuring out your life at 36. The room fell silent as she paused, and then she delivered the words that would change everything. "You know what? You've always been the family mistake. Your brother Michael is a successful lawyer. Your sister Sarah runs her own marketing firm, and here you are, still figuring out your life at 32. The silence that followed was deafening. Other family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing that my mother had crossed a line from constructive concern into personal attack. My Aunt Patricia looked down at her plate, while my cousins exchanged awkward glances. But as I sat there, looking at my mother's face with that familiar expression of disappointment and frustration, I realized that this moment represented exactly the opportunity I had been contemplating for months. The dramatic contrast between her perception of me as the family mistake and the reality of my situation had created the perfect catalyst for a revelation that would fundamentally reshape our family dynamics. More importantly, her comments had crystallized my understanding that continued secrecy was not just emotionally unsustainable, but actually harmful to family relationships that could be transformed through honest communication about my actual achievements and capabilities. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I knew that my response to this moment would determine not just the remainder of our dinner conversation, but the future of my relationships with every family member at the table. The double life that I had maintained for nearly a decade was about to end, and the revelation that followed would provide lessons about success, assumptions, and the various paths to achievement that don't conform to traditional expectations. The stage was set for the most dramatic family revelation of my life, and the transformation that would follow would benefit everyone involved in ways that none of us could fully anticipate. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 seconds. I could feel the eyes of every family member at the table, some looking at me with sympathy, others with curiosity about how I would respond to my mother's devastating characterization of me as the family mistake. I took a slow breath, placed my hands flat on the table, and looked directly at my mother. When I spoke, my voice was calm and steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Actually, Mom, there's something I think you should know," I began, reaching into my purse for my phone. "Something that might change your perspective about my life choices and what I've been building over the past decade." The tone of my voice, must have conveyed something unusual because the ambient restaurant noise seemed to fade as everyone at our table focused their attention completely on what I was about to say. You mentioned that you live in a beautiful building with excellent management, I continued, maintaining eye contact with my mother. You've told us many times about how responsive the property management is, how well-maintained everything is, and how much you appreciate the new owners who took over a few years ago. My mother nodded slowly, clearly uncertain about where this conversation was heading, but beginning to sense that something significant was about to unfold. Well, Mom, I said, pulling up the Morrison Properties website on my phone and turning the screen toward her. I'd like you to meet those new owners. The website homepage featured a professional photograph of me in a business suit, standing in front of the Riverside Gardens building, with the heading, Jessica Morrison, founder and CEO, Morrison Properties, Chicago's premier boutique residential investment firm. My mother stared at the phone screen for several seconds, her expression shifting from confusion to recognition to something approaching shock. I don't understand, she said quietly. What does this mean? It means, Mom, that the building you've been living in for the past 4 years, Riverside Gardens at 1247 North Lakeshore Drive, Unit 3B, is owned by Morrison Properties, which means it's owned by me. I'm your landlord. The words hit the table like a physical impact. My brother Michael's fork clattered against his plate as he set it down abruptly. Sarah's mouth fell open. My Aunt Patricia gasped audibly, while my cousins exchanged looks of complete bewilderment. That's impossible, my mother whispered, but her voice carried uncertainty rather than conviction. I pulled up the property management app on my phone and navigated to her tenant profile. Linda Morrison, Unit 3B, lease renewal due March 31st, monthly rent $2,650. Excellent tenant history, no maintenance issues outstanding. I turned the phone toward her again. Would you like to see the photos I have on file of your apartment? The silence that followed was profound. I could see my mother's mind working, trying to process information that completely contradicted everything she thought she knew about my life and capabilities. But how? She finally managed. You work for some small real estate company. You rent an apartment. You drive an old car. How could you possibly own my building? I don't work for a real estate company, Mom. I own a real estate company. Morrison Properties manages over 430 rental units across Chicago with a combined value of approximately $89 million. Your building alone is worth $10.8 million. Michael found his voice first among my siblings. Jessica, what are you talking about? Are you saying you're some kind of real estate mogul? I'm saying that everything you think you know about my life and career is completely wrong, I replied, my voice gaining strength as I continued. For the past 10 years, while you've all been expressing concern about my lack of direction and financial stability, I've been building a real estate investment company that generates over $1.8 million in annual income. Sarah leaned forward, her expression intense. That's impossible. We would have known. You would have told us. Would I have? I asked, looking around the table. When have any of you ever asked about my business in a way that suggested genuine interest rather than polite concern? When have any of you ever considered that maybe my career choices were strategic rather than evidence of confusion or lack of ambition? I pulled up another screen on my phone, the Morrison Properties portfolio summary. Here's what I've been doing while you've been worried about my future. I own or manage properties in Lincoln Park, Lakeview, River North, Wicker Park, Logan Square, and Pilsen. I have partnerships with institutional investors, including the Steinberg Family Office, Meridian Capital Partners, and 3 other investment groups that collectively manage over $2 billion in assets. The numbers seem to physically impact my family members. I could see them trying to process the scale of what I was describing, attempting to reconcile this information with their long-held beliefs about my situation. My mother was still staring, at the phone screen, scrolling through property photos and financial summaries that documented an empire she had never suspected existed. "But why didn't you tell us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because every time I tried to share anything about my work, you dismissed it as small-scale dabbling that wasn't leading anywhere significant," I replied. "Because every family gathering turned into interventions about my lack of career progress and suggestions that I needed to find real employment with benefits and stability." I turned to address the entire table. "Do you remember Christmas dinner 2022, when you staged an intervention about my life choices? You were concerned about my financial security while speaking to someone whose net worth exceeded $12 million. You were worried about my retirement planning while talking to someone whose passive income was approaching $800,000 annually." The mathematical reality of these numbers was beginning to sink in. I could see family members doing mental calculations, trying to understand how the person they had viewed as struggling financially was describing wealth that exceeded anything they had imagined. "But your apartment," my Aunt Patricia said weakly. "You live in that small rental." "Because tying up capital in an expensive personal residence would reduce my ability to acquire income-producing properties," I explained. "Every dollar I didn't spend on luxury housing was a dollar I could invest in real estate that generates ongoing returns. It's called strategic capital allocation." Michael, ever the lawyer, was beginning to ask more analytical questions. "Jessica, if this is true, and I'm still trying to process that it could be true, why maintain such elaborate secrecy? Why not share your success with family?" Because I learned early on that sharing details about my business led to advice about risks I should avoid, suggestions that I should pursue more traditional career paths, and general skepticism about real estate. "Investment as a legitimate wealth-building strategy," I replied. "It was easier to let you think I was struggling than to constantly defend business decisions to people who didn't understand the industry or the strategies involved." Sarah was shaking her head slowly. "Jessica, this is incredible. But also hurt. We're your family. We should have known about your success. We should have been celebrating your achievements instead of treating me like the family failure," I finished. "Instead of expressing constant concern about my inability to build a stable career. Instead of offering advice about finding real jobs with benefits." The words hung in the air, carrying years of accumulated frustration and hurt that I had suppressed in the interest of maintaining family harmony. My mother was still processing the fundamental revelation. "So, when I've been praising the excellent management of my building, when I've been talking about how wonderful the new owners are, you've been praising my property management capabilities while simultaneously expressing concern about my professional competence," I confirmed. "The building improvements you've enjoyed, the responsive maintenance service, the reasonable rent increases, that's all been my business strategy and operational excellence." The irony was finally sinking in for everyone at the table. The family, member they had viewed as least successful, had been providing excellent housing and service to the family member who had been most critical of her achievements. Tyler, who had been silent throughout this revelation, finally spoke up. "Aunt Jessica, does this mean you're, really rich?" The innocent directness of the question broke some of the tension, and I couldn't help but smile. "Tyler, it means that your Aunt Jessica has been very fortunate to build a successful business that has provided financial independence and the ability to help family members when they need assistance." I turned back to my mother. "Speaking of which, Mom, about that rent increase notice you received, I think we can work something out." The immediate aftermath of my revelation was unlike anything I could have anticipated. The restaurant around us continued its normal evening rhythm, servers delivering plates, other families celebrating their own milestones, while our table sat in a bubble of stunned silence as everyone processed the complete inversion of everything they thought they knew about me. My mother was the first to break the silence, and when she spoke, her voice carried a mixture of awe, confusion, and something that might have been pride. Jessica, I don't even know what to say. All these years, I thought. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would have acknowledged the depth of her misunderstanding. You thought I was failing, I said gently, reaching across the table to touch her hand. And I let you think that because it seemed easier than constantly defending business decisions to people who couldn't understand why I was making unconventional choices. Michael, ever the analytical lawyer, was beginning to ask the practical questions that his mind naturally generated when confronted with complex new information. Jessica, the legal and financial structures required for this kind of operation must be incredibly sophisticated. Who's been handling your corporate law, your tax planning, your liability protection? I smiled at the first question that treated me as a peer rather than a family member in need of guidance. David Chen at Morrison & Associates handles most of my legal work, though I also work with specialists in real estate law, securities regulation, and international tax planning. The business structure includes multiple LLCs, strategic partnerships with institutional investors, and operational agreements that took years to develop and optimize. The technical complexity of my business operations was beginning to register with family members who were recognizing that successful management of $89 million in real estate assets required exactly the kind of sophisticated professional capabilities they had never associated with me. Sarah was shaking her head in amazement. Jessica, the marketing and business development required to build institutional partnerships, the operational systems needed to manage hundreds of rental units. This is incredibly impressive. I had no idea you had developed these kinds of capabilities, because every time I tried to explain what I was working on, the conversation turned into concerns about whether real estate was stable enough to provide security, or suggestions that I should consider more traditional career paths, I replied. It became easier to just let everyone assume I was dabbling in small projects, rather than continuously defending strategic choices that were actually working quite well. My Aunt Patricia was looking at me with an expression of dawning respect. Jessica, when you were younger, I always thought you were bright but unfocused. I never imagined you had the kind of strategic thinking and business acumen to build something like this. That's exactly the problem, I said, addressing the entire table. Everyone formed opinions about my capabilities and potential based on limited information and conventional expectations, then interpreted everything I did through that lens. When I tried to share my actual progress, it was filtered through assumptions about what I should be doing rather than recognition of what I was actually achieving. Tyler, who had been listening intently to this adult conversation about business and family dynamics, asked another direct question that cut through the complexity. Aunt Jessica, are you mad at everyone for not believing in you? The question forced me to examine my own emotions more carefully than I had during the months of planning for this revelation. Tyler, I'm not mad, but I am disappointed that it took such a dramatic revelation to get everyone to take my work seriously. I wish our family had been better at asking questions and listening carefully instead of making assumptions and offering advice based on incomplete information. My mother was still processing the personal implications of learning that her daughter was her landlord. Jessica, about my rent, about my lease renewal. I feel so embarrassed that I was worried about affording the increase while you were the one setting the rates. Mom, that's actually something I want to address, I said, grateful for the opportunity to transition from revelation to practical problem solving. Your housing situation has been one of the reasons I decided it was time to end the secrecy. I couldn't continue watching you worry about rent increases while I was the person who could easily address those concerns. I pulled out my phone and opened the property management app. Here's what I'm going to do. Your lease renewal is coming up next month, and instead of the market rate increase to $2,650, I'm going to lock your rent at $2,000 per month for as long as you want to stay in the building. But more importantly, I want you to stop worrying about housing costs during retirement. That stress is completely unnecessary when your daughter owns the building. The relief on my mother's face was immediate and profound. The financial anxiety that had been driving her consideration of relocating to a smaller, less expensive apartment was suddenly eliminated by her daughter's ability to address the problem directly. "But Jessica," she said hesitantly, "I don't want special treatment just because we're related. That doesn't seem fair to your business or your other tenants." "Mom, providing family members with housing security is one of the reasons I built this business," I replied. "The ability to help people I care about was always part of my long-term strategic vision. Besides, you've been an excellent tenant for years, and excellent tenants deserve consideration for lease renewals." Michael was beginning to understand the broader implications of my business success. "Jessica, this changes everything about how we think about family financial planning. If you've achieved this level of success, you could potentially help all of us with various financial goals and challenges." "That's true," I acknowledged, "but I hope you understand why I was reluctant to reveal this capability while everyone was treating me like someone who needed career advice and financial guidance. It's difficult to offer help to people who don't respect your judgment or capabilities." Sarah was nodding with understanding. "Jessica, we owe you a huge apology. All of us. We made assumptions about your situation and capabilities based on superficial observations, then treated you condescendingly for years while you were actually building something remarkable. The apology I need isn't for misunderstanding my business success," I said carefully. "It's for the pattern of dismissing my choices and offering unsolicited advice without taking time to understand what I was actually trying to accomplish. Success isn't just about the financial results. It's about being respected for your strategic thinking and decision-making process." The conversation continued for another hour, covering topics ranging from my specific investment strategies and business operations to the family dynamics that had created such fundamental misunderstandings. Other restaurant patrons occasionally glanced at our table, probably wondering why our group seemed so intensely focused on serious conversation during what should have been a celebratory dinner. As the evening concluded, my mother made a request that surprised me. "Jessica, I know this is asking a lot after years of not taking your work seriously, but would you be willing to give me a tour of the building? I'd like to understand what you've built and see my home through your eyes as a property owner and business operator." "I'd love that, Mom," I replied, genuinely touched by her desire to understand my work rather than simply benefit from the housing security I could provide. "I think you'll find it interesting to see how property management actually works behind the scenes." The drive home that evening was surreal. For the first time in nearly a decade, I didn't need to maintain careful separation between my family relationships and my professional identity. The revelation had been more successful than I had dared to hope, transforming not just their understanding of my capabilities, but also creating opportunities for authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than assumptions and misconceptions. More importantly, the evening had demonstrated something crucial about success, family dynamics, and the importance of communication in maintaining healthy relationships. The years of secrecy that had seemed strategically necessary had actually prevented the kind of authentic connections that make achievement meaningful and rewarding. Over the following months, my relationships with family members evolved in ways that were both surprising and deeply satisfying. Rather than being treated as the family member who needed guidance, I became someone whose advice was sought and respected. Rather than receiving suggestions about career development, I was asked for insights about investment strategies and business planning. My mother's apartment tour led to her becoming one of my most effective references for prospective tenants, as she could speak authentically about the quality of property management and residential experience at Riverside Gardens. Tyler began asking about real estate investment as a potential career path, leading to conversations about education, internship opportunities, and long-term strategic thinking. Most significantly, the revelation created space for the kind of family financial planning that can benefit everyone involved. Without the burden of secrecy and misunderstanding, I could offer assistance with everything from Tyler's college expenses to retirement planning for my parents, transforming family financial stress into collaborative problem solving. The story of my revelation at Romano's restaurant became family legend, referenced whenever someone began making assumptions about another person's situation or capabilities. It served as a permanent reminder that success takes many different forms, and that understanding someone's actual circumstances requires careful listening rather than quick judgments based on superficial observations. The transformation wasn't just about my family's recognition of my business success. It was about creating authentic relationships based on mutual respect, accurate understanding, and appreciation for the various paths to achievement and fulfillment that don't conform to conventional expectations but can lead to remarkable outcomes when pursued with strategic thinking, patience, and determination. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.